January 17, 1940, Camp Holabird, Maryland. The morning air bit sharp against the faces of three men standing in a frozen motor pool, their breath rising in pale clouds as they stared at a collection of rusted trucks and aging sedans that groaned under their own weight. Major Robert G. Howie of the U.S. Beside him, two procurement officers stamped their feet against the cold, waiting. The sound of metal scraping concrete echoed from a nearby hangar where mechanics wrestled with a transmission that had failed for the third time that week. In 6 months, the German Wehrmacht had rolled through Poland with a mechanized fury that left the world gasping. And here, in the heart of American military preparation, the U.S. Army couldn't keep its own vehicles running for more than 40 miles without a breakdown. Major Howie looked down at his clipboard and underlined a single word he had written the night before: mobility. The question wasn't whether America would enter the war. The question was whether American soldiers would be carried to battle or left to walk. The shadow of blitzkrieg hung over every military planner in Washington that winter. The German invasion of Poland had lasted 35 days, not because of superior numbers, but because of superior movement. Panzer divisions, supported by fast reconnaissance vehicles and mechanized infantry, had punctured Polish defenses before they could organize resistance. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. Modern warfare belonged to the force that could move fastest, hit hardest, and adapt quickest. Traditional military doctrine, with its emphasis on fixed fortifications and slow-moving infantry columns, had been obliterated in the Polish countryside. And the United States Army, still emerging from 2 decades of Depression-era neglect, possessed almost nothing that could match German speed or flexibility. Its motor pool consisted largely of commercial trucks converted for military use, heavy and unreliable machines that broke down on paved roads, let alone the muddy tracks and cratered fields of actual combat. The cavalry, that romantic vestige of 19th-century warfare, still patrolled on horseback at Fort Riley, their officers clinging to the belief that a well-trained rider could outmaneuver any machine. But Major Howie and the officers of the Quartermaster Corps understood what the cavalrymen refused to accept. The future would not wait for horses to catch up. What the Army needed, Howie concluded, was something that didn't yet exist. Not a truck, not a car, something in between. A vehicle light enough to navigate narrow European roads and dense jungle paths, powerful enough to carry troops and supplies across mountains and deserts, simple enough that a farm boy drafted from Iowa could repair it with basic tools under enemy fire. It had to be versatile, carrying reconnaissance teams one day and pulling artillery the next. It had to be cheap enough to manufacture by the tens of thousands, and rugged enough to survive conditions no peacetime vehicle would ever endure. In February 1940, the Quartermaster Corps issued a technical specification to 135 American automotive manufacturers. The requirements read like a fever dream. The vehicle must weigh no more than 1,300 pounds. It must have 4-wheel drive, a fold-down windshield, 3 bucket seats, and a payload capacity of 600 pounds. It must reach 50 miles per hour on flat roads and climb a 60-degree slope. And the manufacturers had 49 days to submit a working prototype. 49 days. Most automotive development cycles required 18 months to 2 years. The Army was asking for a miracle in 7 weeks. 133 companies declined immediately. The specifications were impossible, they said. Limit alone defied physics. 4-wheel drive systems of the era added at least 500 pounds to a vehicle's frame. To build something that light, that strong, that versatile would require abandoning every established principle of automotive design. Only 2 companies responded with interest. The first was American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania, a struggling manufacturer of economy cars teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The second was Willys Overland Motors of Toledo, Ohio, another depression-wounded firm desperate for government contracts. But it was Bantam, the smallest and most desperate of the 2, that assigned the project to a man the automotive industry had already written off as finished. His name was Karl Probst, and he had 72 hours to decide if the impossible was merely improbable. Karl Probst sat in his Detroit apartment on the night of July 17, 1940, holding a telegram that had arrived that afternoon. He was 51 years old, a freelance automotive engineer whose career had been quietly brilliant and publicly invisible. He had designed components for Packard, consulted for Studebaker, contributed to projects whose successes were credited to other men, while his name appeared only in patent filings and internal memos. The automotive world was a closed fraternity in 1940, dominated by Detroit's big three: General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and Probst had never belonged to their inner circles. He was a problem solver, not a politician, a designer who preferred slide rules and drafting tables to boardroom negotiations. The telegram was from American Bantam, offering him a consulting contract to design their military vehicle prototype. The deadline was impossible. The specifications were absurd. The payment was modest. Probst read the telegram 3 times, folded it carefully, and caught the first train to Pennsylvania the next morning. He understood something the big manufacturers did not. Sometimes impossible problems require impossible thinking. Probst arrived at Bantam's modest factory in Butler to find a company held together by hope and stubbornness. The factory floor was half empty, its workforce reduced to skeleton crews. The company president, Frank Fenn, greeted Probst with a handshake and a confession. Bantam had no engineering staff capable of designing a military vehicle from scratch. They had no prototype facilities. They had no testing grounds. What they had was a government contract worth $8,000 if they delivered a working prototype by September 23, and bankruptcy if they failed. Probst listened, nodded, and asked for a drafting table, a set of blueprints of Bantam's existing chassis, and a pot of coffee. Then he locked himself in a small office and began to sketch. What Probst created over the next 5 days existed somewhere between inspiration and desperation. He started with Bantam's Model 60 chassis, a lightweight frame designed for their economy cars, and began stripping away everything unnecessary. He removed excess steel, eliminated decorative elements, and reduced the engine compartment to its bare minimum. Where other engineers added weight for durability, Probst redistributed stress across the frame itself, using triangulated supports that borrowed principles from bridge construction. For the engine, he specified a small 4-cylinder Continental motor producing only 45 horsepower, laughably underpowered by conventional standards, but sufficient if the vehicle weighed almost nothing. He sketched a simple leaf spring suspension that could absorb punishment without complex shock systems. He drew a boxy, angular body with flat panels that could be stamped quickly and cheaply from sheet metal. No curves, no chrome, no concessions to aesthetics. Every line served a function, every component justified its weight. The design that emerged from Probst's drafting table looked less like a car and more like a mechanical mule stripped to its skeleton. On September 21, 1940, 70 days after receiving the contract and 2 days before the Army's deadline, Bantam delivered the first prototype to Camp Holabird. It arrived on a flatbed truck because no one was certain it would survive the 200-mile drive from Pennsylvania. Major Howie and his testing team circled the vehicle slowly, their expressions carefully neutral. It was ugly. Brutally. Uncompromisingly ugly. The body was little more than a stamped steel tub bolted to a frame. The seats were flat metal benches. The windshield folded flat against the hood, held by 2 simple latches. The entire vehicle looked like it had been assembled by someone who had seen a car described in a telegram but never actually witnessed one. One of the junior officers tapped the side panel with his knuckle, and the metal rang hollow. "This is it?" he asked. Probst, standing beside the vehicle in his worn suit coat, nodded. They drove the Bantam prototype up muddy slopes that regular trucks couldn't climb. They forded streams that reached the floorboards. They loaded it with sandbags until the payload exceeded specifications, then drove it over railroad ties and through ditches. They ran it continuously for 16 hours, shut it down for basic maintenance, and ran it for another 12. The little vehicle shuddered and rattled and complained, but it did not break. It climbed the 60-degree test slope in second gear, its four-wheel drive clawing up the incline, while heavier vehicles spun their wheels helplessly at the bottom. It reached 53 miles per hour on the straightaway, despite carrying 3 soldiers and a full load of equipment. When the windshield was folded down and a machine gun mounted on a pedestal behind the front seats, the vehicle transformed from transportation into a mobile weapons platform. Major Howie watched the tests in silence, occasionally making notes on his clipboard. On the third day, he approached Probst and asked a single question. "Can you build 10,000 of these?" Probst's answer was honest. "I don't know, but someone can." The someone turned out to be Willis Overland and Ford, both of whom had been watching Bantam's tests with predatory interest. The Army, recognizing that tiny Bantam lacked the manufacturing capacity to produce vehicles at wartime scale, made a decision that would haunt Karl Probst for the rest of his life. They distributed his blueprints to Willis and Ford, essentially inviting them to copy his design. Willis produced a heavier, more powerful version, with a larger engine. Ford streamlined the manufacturing process. Both companies had the resources to underbid Bantam for mass production contracts. By November 1941, Bantam had been effectively shut out of the very project they had pioneered. Probst's design became the foundation for the vehicle that Willis would brand as the Jeep, derived either from the military designation GP for general purpose or from a character in the Popeye comic strips, depending on which origin story one believed. Karl Probst received no royalties, no recognition in the military contracts, no percentage of the millions of dollars that would flow to Willis and Ford. His name appeared nowhere in the official histories being written even as the first Jeeps rolled off assembly lines. The rejected engineer had created the most important vehicle of the war, and history was preparing to forget him. But the Jeep itself refused to be forgotten. By December 1941, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor and America lurched fully into war, Willis Overland had already delivered nearly 20,000 Jeeps to the U.S. Army. Production accelerated to a pace that seemed impossible. At peak output, a new Jeep rolled off the assembly lines every 90 seconds. Ford joined production under license, and together the two manufacturers would produce over 640,000 Jeeps before war's end. The vehicles shipped to every theater, every climate, every type of terrain the war could offer. They landed on North African beaches where temperatures reached 130 degrees. They clawed through Italian mountains where snow buried them to their axles. They slogged through Pacific jungles where humidity rotted everything and mud swallowed vehicles twice their size. And everywhere they went, they worked. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but they worked. General George S. Patton called the Jeep one of the three tools that won the war, alongside the Dakota transport plane and the atomic bomb, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, when asked after the war to name the weapons that ensured Allied victory, listed the Jeep before mentioning tanks or artillery. But it was the ordinary soldiers, the riflemen and engineers and medics who rode in Jeeps daily, who understood most clearly what Probst's design had given them. The Jeep was democratic in a way no military vehicle had ever been. It didn't require specialized training or engineering degrees to maintain. A farm kid who'd grown up fixing tractors could swap out a Jeep's spark plugs under fire. A mechanic's apprentice from Brooklyn could replace a wheel bearing using the tools stored in the vehicle's own toolbox. The Jeep didn't elevate its driver above the infantry. It joined them, carrying them through the same mud, the same bullets, the same impossible conditions. It was a tool, not a throne. In the summer of 1944, a Jeep carrying 4 American soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division rolled through a small village in Normandy, 3 weeks after D-Day. The village had been occupied by German forces for 4 years, its streets patrolled by Kübelwagens and motorcycle troops. Now the Germans were gone, retreating toward Paris ahead of the Allied advance, and the villagers emerged from their homes to watch the Americans pass. An elderly man stood at the roadside, his cap held against his chest, and as the Jeep approached, He raised one hand in a tentative wave. The jeep stopped. The sergeant in the passenger seat nodded to the old man and asked in broken French if the village needed medical supplies. The old man shook his head, too emotional to speak, but he reached out and placed his palm flat against the jeep's hood, feeling the warmth of the engine, the realness of the machine. To him, this ugly little vehicle represented something more powerful than the tanks that had rolled through his village earlier that morning. The tanks were weapons of war. The jeep was proof that America had arrived, and with America came the promise that occupation would end, that hunger would ease, that freedom might be possible again. He did not know the jeep's history. He did not know about Karl Probst or the rejected blueprints or the 49-day deadline. He knew only that this machine had crossed an ocean to reach his village, and that the young men riding in it had come to fight for people they had never met. He stepped back and saluted, his hand trembling, as the jeep rolled forward into the village square. The German soldiers who encountered jeeps in combat experienced a different revelation, one that struck at the core of their understanding about American military capability. Wehrmacht officers had been trained to view American forces as wealthy but soft, industrially powerful but tactically naive. They expected American soldiers to arrive in heavy, comfortable vehicles suited for paved roads but helpless in real combat conditions. Instead, they found jeeps. Everywhere. Jeeps carrying reconnaissance teams that appeared on German flanks before conventional scouts could report their positions. Jeeps pulling anti-tank guns that could be deployed and firing before German armor could maneuver to respond. Jeeps mounted machine guns that harassed supply lines, then vanished into forests before infantry could organize pursuit. A captured German major, interrogated in Tunisia in early 1943, expressed frustration that bordered on disbelief. "You have built a motorcycle with 4 wheels and the protection of a truck. It goes where our motorcycles go, carries what our trucks carry, and you make them faster than we can count them." The jeep challenged German assumptions about American warfare. It was simple but not crude, mass-produced but not careless, cheap but not fragile. It represented an approach to military logistics that the Wehrmacht, for all its early successes, had never fully mastered. The ability to provide every unit, from mechanized divisions to isolated outposts, with reliable, versatile transportation. In the Pacific Theater, the jeep became even more essential because it operated in environments where traditional military vehicles simply died. The islands that American forces invaded, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Philippines, were hostile to machinery in ways that European battlefields were not. Humidity corroded metal. Jungle mud, thick as concrete and acidic from rotting vegetation, ate through gaskets and seals. Temperatures that swung from 100 degrees in daytime to torrential monsoon rains at night destroyed engines designed for temperate climates. Standard military trucks bogged down immediately, their weight pressing them into mud that hardened around their axles like a trap. Half-tracks fared little better, their complicated drive systems clogging with vines and debris. The jeep, with its high ground clearance, simple 4-cylinder engine, and lightweight construction, pushed through conditions that stopped everything else. Marines on Guadalcanal used jeeps to haul wounded from jungle aid stations to beachside hospitals over roads that were little more than muddy tracks hacked through the undergrowth. Engineers mounted welding equipment on jeeps and drove them to remote construction sites where bridges needed repair or airstrips required extension. When conventional supply trucks couldn't navigate the mud, jeeps pulled trailers loaded with ammunition and rations to forward positions, making 3 or 4 trips where 1 truck trip had been planned, compensating for smaller capacity with sheer persistence. There was a moment, recorded in the diary of a Marine Corps lieutenant named Robert Leckie, that captured the jeep's symbolic importance in the Pacific. It was November 1943, and Leckie's unit had just secured a beachhead on Bougainville after 3 days of fighting that left his company at half strength. They had pushed inland barely a mile, digging foxholes in mud that filled with water as fast as they could bail it out. Supplies were scarce. Artillery support was non-existent because the big guns were still being unloaded at the beach. The jungle pressed in on all sides, and Japanese snipers had killed 2 men that morning. Morale was not broken, but it was bending. Then, late in the afternoon, Lecky heard an engine. Not the distant rumble of ships offshore or the buzz of aircraft overhead, but the immediate, mechanical growl of something approaching through the jungle. A jeep emerged from the tree line, its driver navigating around shell craters and fallen logs, and pulled up beside Lecky's foxhole. The driver, a kid who looked about 19, handed down a crate of ammunition, 2 boxes of K-rations, and a bag of mail from home. "More coming," the kid said, and drove back into the jungle before Lecky could thank him. Lecky wrote that night, "That jeep, that ridiculous little car, means more to us than bombers or battleships. It means someone remembered we're here. It means we're not alone." The jeep had become a promise, a mobile reminder that the American war machine, vast and impersonal as it was, would reach even the furthest, wettest, most miserable corner of the Pacific to deliver what its soldiers needed. Back in the United States, jeep production had become a matter of national identity. Willys Overland factories in Toledo ran 24-hour shifts, their assembly lines illuminated by arc lights that turned night into artificial day. Women who had never worked in factories before the war now riveted body panels and installed drive shafts, their efficiency rates climbing weekly as they mastered tasks that supervisors had initially assumed required male workers. Ford's River Rouge plant in Michigan converted entire buildings to Jeep production, using the same mass manufacturing principles that had made the Model T affordable and now made the Jeep ubiquitous. Newsreel cameras filmed the assembly lines, and theaters across America showed footage of Jeeps rolling off. Production lines in an endless stream, each one identical to the last, each one destined for some distant battlefield. The narrator's voice, chipper and confident, assured audiences that American industry was outproducing the Axis powers in every category. What the newsreels didn't show were the margins, the near misses, the constant engineering compromises required to maintain production at that pace. Willys engineers discovered that the original Continental engine, while reliable, couldn't be manufactured fast enough to meet demand. They designed their own engine, the Go Devil, and retooled factories to produce it while Jeeps were still rolling off the lines with Continental motors. Ford's version of the Jeep used slightly different body stampings, not because they improved the design, but because Ford's presses were configured differently than Willys's. The 2 vehicles were functionally identical but built from different parts, a logistical nightmare that the Quartermaster Corps solved by creating interchangeable supply chains. It was messy, inefficient by peacetime standards, and it worked because everyone involved understood that perfection was the enemy of production. Karl Probst, meanwhile, had returned to obscurity. He continued consulting work for smaller manufacturers, designing components and solving problems that other engineers found too difficult or too tedious. He did not attend Willys Overland shareholder meetings or Ford executive dinners. He was not invited to demonstrate Jeeps for visiting generals or foreign dignitaries. The automotive press, when it wrote about the Jeep's origins, credited Willys's engineers or the Army's Quartermaster Corps, rarely mentioning Bantam and never mentioning Probst by name. In 1943, a journalist from the Saturday Evening Post tracked Probst down for an interview, intending to write a feature about the unknown genius who designed the war's most important vehicle. Probst declined. He told the journalist that the Jeep's success belonged to the thousands of workers who built them, the soldiers who drove them, and the mechanics who kept them running under impossible conditions. His own role, he said, was simply to draw lines on paper. The journalist pressed, pointing out that without those lines on paper, the Jeep wouldn't exist. Probst responded with something close to philosophy. The Jeep exists because it had to exist. If I hadn't drawn it, someone else would have. The war demanded it, and America answered. That's the story that matters. The article was never published, but the war didn't care about modesty or credit. It cared about results, and the Jeep delivered results on scales that even optimistic projections hadn't anticipated. By 1944, Jeeps were being used for purposes never imagined in the original specifications. In the Italian campaign, engineers welded metal rails to Jeep hoods and mounted multiple rocket launchers, creating improvised artillery that could fire devastating barrages and then relocate before German counter-battery fire could respond. In France, reconnaissance units equipped Jeeps with extra fuel tanks and heavy machine guns, turning them into raiding vehicles that penetrated deep behind German lines, ambushed supply convoys, and vanished before reinforcements arrived. Medics stripped seats from Jeeps and installed litter racks, converting them into ambulances that could evacuate wounded from forward positions over terrain that conventional ambulances couldn't navigate. Jeeps towed gliders, carried generals, delivered ice cream to troops in rest areas, hauled prisoners to detention camps, transported journalists to front lines, served as mobile command posts, and performed 1,000 other tasks that blurred the line between transportation and adaptation. The vehicle's versatility wasn't a feature Probst had designed into the blueprints. It emerged from the vehicle's simplicity, from the fact that it was basic enough that soldiers could modify it to suit whatever the war demanded. Soviet forces, receiving Jeeps through the Lend-Lease program, embraced them with an enthusiasm that surprised American observers. The Red Army had its own vehicles, rugged gas trucks and BA-64 scout cars, but Soviet commanders appreciated the Jeep's combination of speed and reliability. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who would lead Soviet forces into Berlin, reportedly kept a Jeep for his personal use throughout the final year of the war, preferring it to heavier Soviet staff cars. Ordinary Soviet soldiers, accustomed to equipment that required constant maintenance and often failed at critical moments, found the Jeep almost miraculous in its reliability. A Soviet tank officer, interviewed after the war, described driving a Jeep for the first time. "We thought this small car would be weak, a toy for American officers. Then we drove it through mud that stopped our trucks. We drove it 100 kilometers without rest. The engine ran smoothly. No problems. We understood then that Americans build things to work, not to look impressive." This observation, from a soldier whose nation had endured unimaginable suffering at German hands, revealed something about the Jeep's deeper significance. It was a machine that didn't demand reverence or special knowledge. It asked only to be used, and it worked when used. This democratic accessibility, this refusal to be complicated, made it beloved in ways that more sophisticated weapons never achieved. The sound of a Jeep engine became one of the war's most recognizable auditory signatures, as distinct as the drone of a B-17 or the chatter of an MG-42. That particular four-cylinder growl, mid-range and steady, announced American presence in 1,000 contexts. Civilians in occupied France heard Jeeps approaching, and new liberation had arrived. German soldiers in defensive positions heard Jeeps in the distance, and new American reconnaissance was probing their flanks. Wounded men in field hospitals heard Jeeps pulling up outside, and new ambulances had arrived with more casualties. The sound carried meaning beyond its mechanical function. It was a voice, speaking in the language of internal combustion, and it said, "America is here." Not just American soldiers, but American logistics, American supply chains, American industrial capacity. The Jeep's engine was the sound of a nation that could afford to build 600,000 identical vehicles and ship them to every corner of the planet. It was the sound of abundance in the service of victory. In April 1945, as American and Soviet forces converged on Berlin from opposite directions, Jeeps rolled through devastated German cities that had been pounded into rubble by years of bombing. The contrast was stark and intentional. These German cities, which had celebrated military parades and watched Wehrmacht columns march toward promised conquest, now lay broken beneath the treads and tires of Allied vehicles. American soldiers driving Jeeps through Frankfurt and Munich encountered German civilians who emerged from basements and shelters to watch the occupation begin. The Germans expected retribution, expected the same brutality their own forces had inflicted on occupied populations. Instead, they saw American soldiers distributing rations, directing traffic, setting up medical stations. The Jeeps carried food and medical supplies as often as they carried weapons. An American chaplain, attached to an infantry division entering Bavaria, wrote in his journal about a German woman who approached his jeep as it idled at an intersection. She was elderly, thin, her clothing patched and repatched. She spoke no English and he spoke no German, but she reached into her pocket and withdrew a wrinkled photograph of a young man in Wehrmacht uniform. She pointed to the photograph, then to the sky, a gesture that needed no translation. Her son had not come home. The chaplain nodded, unable to offer comfort in any language. She would understand. Then she did something unexpected. She placed her hand on the jeep's hood, the same gesture the French villager had made a year earlier, and she spoke a single word he recognized. Danke. Thank you. Not for her son's death, not for the war. For the fact that it was ending, that occupation by American forces meant she might survive the peace. The jeep, humming at idle beneath her palm, represented the possibility of survival. The Japanese surrender in August 1945 brought jeeps to Tokyo, where they rolled through streets that had been firebombed into ash fields. American occupation forces used jeeps to patrol neighborhoods, deliver supplies, and transport officials to meetings where the framework of post-war Japan would be negotiated. Japanese civilians, who had been taught that American soldiers were demons who would rape and pillage, instead saw young men who looked bored and tired, driving small vehicles that seemed almost comically undersized compared to the massive tanks and trucks that had appeared in propaganda films. The jeep's modest scale worked in America's favor during occupation. It wasn't intimidating in the way a Sherman tank was intimidating. It didn't dominate intersections or crush pavement under its weight. It was just a car, if an unusually capable one, and that ordinariness made American presence feel less like military domination and more like policing. This was psychological warfare of a subtler kind, the kind that happened not through demonstrations of overwhelming force, but through demonstrations of casual competence. The jeep suggested that America didn't need to threaten or bluster because it had already won, and it had won so decisively that it could afford to arrive in small, practical vehicles rather than armoured behemoths. When the war ended and production contracts were cancelled, Willys Overland faced a challenge. What to do with assembly lines designed to produce military vehicles in a peacetime economy? The solution was elegant. They kept building jeeps, but marketed them to civilians. The CJ-2A, introduced in 1945, was essentially a military jeep with minor modifications, a tailgate, a side-mounted spare tire, and slightly more comfortable seats. Willys advertised it to farmers and ranchers, emphasizing its utility for agricultural work. The marketing worked because it was true. The jeep was exactly what rural America needed. Farmers bought jeeps to patrol fence lines and haul supplies to distant fields. Ranchers used them to check on livestock in terrain that trucks couldn't navigate. Rural mail carriers drove jeeps on routes that would have destroyed conventional postal vehicles. The jeep transitioned from military to civilian life without changing its fundamental nature, because its fundamental nature was utility, and utility was universal. Surplus military jeeps flooded the market as well, purchased by civilians for a few $100s each. Many had been driven hard during the war and required restoration, but their simplicity made restoration accessible. A mechanically inclined owner could rebuild a Jeep engine in a weekend using basic tools and parts ordered from Willys. The Jeep became a fixture of post-war American life, as common in rural driveways as pickup trucks, and far more capable. Karl Probst lived quietly in his later years, watching the vehicle he designed become an American icon without his name ever appearing in the public narrative. He granted occasional interviews to automotive historians, always downplaying his role, always redirecting credit to others. In 1975, at age 86, he received a letter from the Army Quartermaster Corps acknowledging his contribution to the Jeep's design. It was a formal letter, bureaucratic in tone, and it arrived 35 years after he had submitted his blueprints to American Bantam. By then, the Jeep had become synonymous with American military history. It appeared in memoirs and films, in museums and textbooks. Veterans who had driven Jeeps during the war bought them in retirement and restored them, painting them in unit markings, mounting replica machine guns, and driving them in parades. The Jeep was nostalgia, history, and mythology compressed into metal and rubber. And at the center of that mythology was an absence, a blank space where Karl Probst's name should have been. He died in 1963, before the Quartermaster Corps' letter arrived, before any meaningful recognition reached him. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned that he had worked in automotive design, but did not mention the Jeep. History, it seemed, had made its decision about who deserved credit and who deserved forgetting. But machines have longer memories than institutions. Every Jeep still running today, and there are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, scattered across farms and ranches and collectors' garages, carries Karl Probst's decisions embedded in its frame. The angle of the suspension, the placement of the engine, the width of the wheelbase. These are not abstractions or theories. They are physical realities. Mathematical relationships expressed in steel and expressed so well that they still function 80 years after Probst sketched them on paper in that small Pennsylvania office. The Jeep doesn't care who gets credit. It doesn't hold grudges or seek recognition. It simply works, and in working it embodies the principle that drove its creation. Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one, the one that strips away everything unnecessary and focuses only on what must be done. The Jeep's influence extended far beyond its own production run. Every military and civilian utility vehicle designed after 1945 existed in the Jeep's shadow, consciously or unconsciously answering the question, how do we improve on this? The British Land Rover, introduced in 1948, was explicitly designed to compete with surplus American Jeeps flooding the European market. The Soviet GAZ-69, deployed in the 1950s, borrowed heavily from Jeep design principles while adapting them to Soviet manufacturing capabilities and climate requirements. Japanese manufacturers, rebuilding their automotive industry under American occupation, studied Jeeps extensively. Toyota's Land Cruiser and Nissan's Patrol both owe conceptual debts to Probst's original design. Even modern SUVs, those bloated luxury vehicles that dominate American highways, trace their ancestry to the Jeep's fundamental insight, that a vehicle combining car-like handling with truck-like capability would appeal to buyers seeking versatility. The Jeep was the template, the proof of concept, the original answer to a question that the automotive industry has been asking in various forms ever since. What happens when you build a vehicle that refuses to specialize? There is a museum in Toledo, Ohio, not far from the former Willys Overland factory, where a pristine 1945 Willys MB sits on display behind velvet ropes. The placard describes the Jeep's role in World War II, lists its technical specifications, and notes its production numbers. Tourists photograph it, veterans pause before it, school children on field trips learn that this ugly little vehicle helped win the war. But the museum display, for all its careful curation, cannot capture what the Jeep meant to the men who drove it through Normandy hedgerows, or up Sicilian mountain roads, or through Philippine jungles. It cannot convey the sound of that four-cylinder engine running smooth while artillery thundered in the distance, or the feeling of reliability in a world where everything else was breaking down. The museum Jeep is clean, restored, frozen in time. The real Jeeps, the ones that mattered, were covered in mud and dust, scratched and dented, repaired and re-repaired, until their parts were mixtures of Willys and Ford and improvised field modifications. Those Jeeps were not museum pieces. They were tools, used until they broke and then fixed and used again. And when they finally died, worn beyond salvage, they were pushed aside and replaced because there were always more Jeeps, an endless supply rolling off assembly lines, ready to do the work that needed doing. In the end, the Jeep's legacy is not mechanical but philosophical. It proved that democratic principles, simplicity, accessibility, adaptability, could be embedded in technology. The Jeep didn't require elite specialists to operate or maintain, It didn't establish hierarchies between those who understood its mysteries and those who didn't. It was a machine for everyone, designed to serve whoever needed it, capable of being whatever the war demanded. This was American industrial democracy in physical form, the idea that mass production could create not just quantity, but quality, that standardization didn't mean mediocrity, that something built by the millions could still be excellent. The Jeep was the answer to the question Karl Probst had been asked in that impossible telegram in July 1940. Not just can you design a light utility vehicle, but can you design a machine that embodies everything America wants to believe about itself? Probst probably didn't think in those terms as he bent over his drafting table, sketching suspension systems and calculating weight distributions. He was solving a practical problem with practical solutions. But the result transcended practicality. The result became a symbol, a promise, a piece of rolling evidence that American industry, when focused and committed, could create tools of extraordinary capability and distribute them widely enough to change the course of history. The sun sets now over dusty roads in Afghanistan and Iraq, where American soldiers still drive Jeep's descendants, mine-resistant vehicles built on principles first sketched in 1940. It sets over rural farms in Montana, where a 1946 CJ2, a lovingly maintained, still starts on cold mornings and still carries its owner across pastures to check on livestock. It sets over museums and collections and parade routes where restored military jeeps roll slowly, their engines growling that familiar four-cylinder song, reminding audiences of a time when the world hung in balance and a rejected engineer's blueprint became the vehicle that carried freedom forward. Karl Probst is gone. American Bantam is gone. The factories that produced 600,000 wartime Jeeps have been demolished or converted to other purposes. But the Jeep remains, not just as a vehicle, but as a testament to the idea that sometimes the most important innovations come from the unlikeliest sources, that genius doesn't always announce itself with credentials and fanfare, and that the tools which change the world often begin as impossible problems solved by desperate men who refuse to accept that impossible means unachievable. There is a photograph, black and white, slightly out of focus, taken somewhere in Germany in the spring of 1945. It shows a Jeep parked at the side of a muddy road, its hood propped open while a young soldier leans over the engine, wrench in hand. Behind him, the landscape is scarred and broken, shattered trees, cratered earth, the skeletal remains of a farmhouse reduced to blackened timbers. The soldier's uniform is filthy, his face smudged with grease and exhaustion, but his posture suggests concentration rather than despair. He is fixing something. The Jeep has broken down, as all machines eventually do, and he is making it work again. The photograph captures no dramatic moment, no battle or surrender or triumph. It documents only maintenance, the ordinary act of keeping a tool functional so that the work can continue. This is the image that best represents what the Jeep meant to the war effort. Not the newsreel footage of assembly lines or the propaganda posters showing heroic soldiers racing toward victory. Not the museum displays or the restored collector's items gleaming under showroom lights. But this, a tired soldier repairing a machine by the side of a road, doing what needs to be done because the war won't wait for perfect conditions or ideal circumstances. The Jeep made this kind of competence possible. It gave every unit, every soldier, every forgotten outpost the ability to maintain mobility without relying on specialized mechanics or rare replacement parts. It democratized capability in a way that reshaped modern warfare, proving that victory didn't belong only to those with the most sophisticated weapons or the most brilliant strategies, but to those who could keep moving forward regardless of obstacles. Karl Probst understood this instinctively when he stripped away everything unnecessary from his design, when he chose simplicity over sophistication, function over form. He couldn't have known that his blueprints would produce hundreds of thousands of vehicles that would serve in every theater of the war. He couldn't have predicted that his design would outlive him by decades, influencing generations of vehicles and establishing principles that would define military logistics for the remainder of the century. He only knew that the army had asked an impossible question, and he had answered it the only way he knew how, by solving the problem in front of him with the tools available and the time permitted. That he received no fame for this, no fortune, no recognition beyond belated letters from bureaucratic offices. This seems unjust, until one considers that Probst himself would have rejected such recognition as missing the point. The Jeep wasn't about individual genius. It was about collective need met by focused effort. It was about a nation that, when challenged, could mobilize its industrial capacity and engineering talent to create exactly what the moment required. The German soldiers who surrendered to American forces in those final months of the war often remarked on the sheer abundance of American equipment. Not just jeeps, but everything: trucks, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies. The German military had been fighting on short rations and dwindling reserves for years, cannibalizing damaged equipment to keep other equipment running, stretching supply lines beyond their breaking point. The Americans arrived with such overwhelming material superiority that it seemed almost wasteful. Jeeps sat parked in motor pools by the dozens, ready reserves waiting to replace vehicles that hadn't even broken down yet. This abundance was itself a weapon, a psychological assault on enemy morale. It communicated a simple message. You cannot win this through attrition, because we have more of everything than you can possibly destroy. The Jeep embodied this message more effectively than heavier weapons precisely because it was so ordinary, so ubiquitous. One tank might be impressive, 100 tanks might be intimidating, but thousands upon thousands of Jeeps, performing every conceivable function, present everywhere simultaneously. This suggested an industrial capacity so vast that resistance was ultimately futile. But the Jeep also represented something the Axis powers had never fully understood about American culture: the belief that practical solutions trump ideological purity. German military doctrine emphasized specialized equipment for specialized roles: reconnaissance vehicles for reconnaissance, transport trucks for transport, command cars for command. This specialization created efficiency in theory, but rigidity in practice. When conditions changed or unexpected challenges arose, specialized equipment often proved inadequate. The Jeep, by contrast, embraced adaptability as its core principle. It could be whatever the situation demanded because it was simple enough to modify and robust enough to absorb abuse. This adaptability reflected a broader American pragmatism, a cultural willingness to improvise and adjust rather than adhering to predetermined plans. The Jeep was American in its bones, not because it was built in American factories, but because it embodied American values of utility, flexibility, and democratic accessibility. 60,000 Jeeps went to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, where they served alongside T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers in the brutal campaigns that pushed German forces back from Stalingrad to Berlin. Soviet soldiers appreciated the Jeep's reliability, but they also recognized something else. It was a gift, a tangible demonstration that the United States was committed to Allied victory. The Jeep wasn't being sold or leased in any meaningful sense. It was being given, along with trucks and tanks and aircraft and millions of tons of other supplies, because American factories could produce more than American forces alone needed. This generosity was strategic, certainly, but it was also genuine. The United States understood that winning the war required equipping all Allied forces, not just its own troops. The Jeep rolling through Russian mud carried American spare parts and American fuel, maintained by Soviet mechanics trained with American manuals. It was a mechanical ambassador, proof that the Grand Alliance was more than political rhetoric. When the war ended and soldiers returned home, many brought with them memories of particular Jeeps, specific vehicles that had carried them through North Africa or Italy or France, that had survived direct hits from artillery fragments, that had forded rivers and climbed mountains and refused to quit despite every mechanical reason they should have failed. These memories carried weight because the Jeeps had been constant companions through experiences that stripped away everything inessential about life. In combat, men learned quickly what mattered and what didn't. Rank mattered less than competence. Appearance mattered not at all compared to function. Complexity was a liability. Simplicity was survival. The Jeep embodied these lessons. It was a machine that had proven itself under the worst conditions humans could create, and it had proven itself not through sophisticated engineering or advanced technology, but through fundamental soundness of design. This was the lesson Karl Probst had taught without intending to teach it, the lesson embedded in every line of his blueprints, that good design doesn't announce itself with flourishes and innovations, but with quiet competence that endures. There are still Jeeps running today that were built during the war years, maintained and restored by enthusiasts who understand that these vehicles are more than nostalgic collectibles. They are functional connections to a moment when the world's fate hung in balance, and ordinary tools performed extraordinary service. When one of these restored Jeeps starts up, when that four-cylinder engine catches and settles into its characteristic idle, the sound is identical to what a soldier heard in 1944 before driving into combat. The intervening decades collapse. The machine doesn't know or care that the war is over, that the soldiers who drove it are gone, that the world it helped save has changed beyond recognition. It only knows how to run, how to perform the task it was designed for, and in that simple persistence, that refusal to be anything other than what it is, the Jeep offers a kind of wisdom. Not every problem requires a complicated solution. Not every challenge demands technological sophistication. Sometimes what's needed is something simple enough to understand, robust enough to trust, and adaptable enough to handle whatever circumstances demand. The rejected blueprint that Karl Probst created in 5 desperate days became the template for millions of vehicles across 8 decades. It influenced military doctrine, reshaped civilian transportation, and established design principles that continue to guide engineers facing similar challenges. How to create maximum capability with minimum complexity. But perhaps the Jeep's deepest legacy is its demonstration that democratic principles can be encoded into technology itself. The Jeep didn't serve elites or specialists. It served everyone equally, demanding nothing but basic maintenance, and rewarding that maintenance with reliable performance. It was a machine for the common soldier, designed to be understood and repaired by anyone with mechanical aptitude and determination. In this way, it embodied the same democratic ideal that American soldiers were fighting to preserve. That capability and opportunity should be accessible to all, not reserved for the privileged few. The sun has set now on that era, on the factories that ran 24-hour shifts, and the assembly lines that produced a Jeep every 90 seconds. The workers who built those vehicles have grown old or passed away. The soldiers who drove them have become grandfathers and great-grandfathers, their stories fading into history and then into legend. But the Jeeps remain stubbornly functional, still capable of climbing hills and fording streams and carrying loads they were never designed to carry. They remain as evidence of what focused intention and practical genius can create when urgent need meets unlimited determination. They remain as monuments to Karl Probst, whose name most people don't know but whose vision changed the world as surely as any general's strategy or any president's decision. In the end, the Jeep conquered every front, not because it was sophisticated or powerful or impressive, but because it was present. It showed up. It worked. It kept working when everything else failed. And in a war that was won not by brilliant strokes of genius, but by steady, grinding application of superior resources and unwavering will, the Jeep was the perfect vehicle for the task. It was America's answer to the question of how to fight a global war. Build something simple, build it well, build it by the hundreds of thousands, and distribute it everywhere it's needed. The rejected blueprint became the accepted standard. The impossible deadline became an achievable reality. The engineer who history forgot created the vehicle that history will always remember. And somewhere, on some dusty road in some corner of the world, a Jeep's engine growls to life and continues the work that began when Karl Probst put pencil to paper and refused to accept that impossible meant unachievable. The sound echoes forward, carrying with it the promise that good design endures, that utility transcends time, and that sometimes the most important innovations come from the unlikeliest places, when ordinary people solve extraordinary problems with nothing more than skill, determination, and the courage to try.